Many people believe that Jesus' closest disciple Peter was crucified upside down, and that the apostle Paul was beheaded by the Roman Emperor Nero. In fact, there's a crazy martyrdom story for just about all the apostles. But how do we know if these accounts are actually true? What's the evidence?
The assumption I'd always heard was all the apostles died as martyrs except for John. So it's not quite that simple.
This is Dr. Sean McDowell, and he's spent the last 15 years trying to answer the question, how did each of the 12 apostles and Paul actually die? No one has studied this topic more than him, so I went to Biola University to get this question answered for myself. This was personal to me because not only have the accounts of the apostles' martyrdom inspired billions of Christians to persevere through persecution for years, but I just published a 40-minute video based on the belief that the apostle Paul was beheaded in Rome. If I'm wrong about the apostle Paul, what else have I been wrong about?
So I basically put it into 4 categories. One is I would put the highest category, like this is just, we have solid historical evidence to conclude that these apostles died as martyrs. The second category is like at least more probable or more plausible than not. Like if you had to put a number on it, it'd be like at least 51%. And then there's the category of indeterminate, and that's where it's like, I don't know historically if we can separate fact from fiction. And then there's a group of apostles who I think died naturally. I think that's actually the most reasonable fate for them.
So based on the evidence he found, Dr. Sean was able to place each apostle on his tier list, including the apostle Paul. But first, I wanted to know what the current popular consensus was on how each of the apostles died. So I asked AI and then presented it to Dr. Sean to see if he agreed. But I was way too nervous to start with the apostle Paul because my personal credibility was on the line. So instead, I started with
Matthew. So AI says that Matthew was likely killed by sword in Ethiopia.
If you remember, the apostle Matthew was the one who used to be a hated tax collector before he quit his job to follow Christ. But after Jesus ascended to heaven, the Bible doesn't really say anything else about him. So how'd he end up dead in Ethiopia?
This is a very late tradition, and I think it's probably not reliable. I think if I had to bet my house on it, I think Matthew probably...
Hold on a sec. Before Dr. Sean reveals where he put Matthew on the tier list, how do we know if one historical account of an apostle's death is more legit than another?
I favored what's called the living memory. You kind of think about the kind of stories that you can pass on from somebody that you know.
Here's what the living memory of the apostles looks like on a timeline. First, you've got Jesus teaching the apostles. Then you've got Jesus sending out the apostles around AD 30. Then you have those same apostles training up younger leaders of the church who live past them. And then those same church leaders training up new leaders who live past their lifetimes.
So the living memory is kind of about a 200-year window. Then it kind of gets lost in history after that.
Basically, any sources that appear in this living memory window is more likely to be true than the ones outside of this window. So when it comes to the apostle Matthew, this story of him being killed by swords in Ethiopia actually comes from 2 sources: the apostolic histories and the martyrology of Rabanus. They say that Matthew made it to Ethiopia preaching the gospel and performing miracles when suddenly he was stabbed with swords by the Ethiopian king because Matthew refused to use his powers to help him win the heart of a woman he wanted to marry. But then Matthew was raised from the dead and everyone believed in Jesus. But then he was killed by swords again by the next king of Ethiopia. Okay, this is an interesting story, but there's only one problem. These sources don't appear until the 6th and 9th century, hundreds of years after the window of living memory. In fact, there are multiple accounts of how he died, including beheading and even one involving a fire dragon. Personally, that's how I want to go. So then, how can we know for sure what happened to Matthew? Well, we can't be sure, but there is some evidence. We know there's a couple sources just outside the window of living memory that claim the apostle died naturally. And there has yet to be found any martyrdom accounts within the window of living memory.
I think if I had to bet my house on it, I think Matthew probably died naturally.
So if Matthew most likely did not die as a martyr, what other apostles' deaths did we get wrong? I mean, one of the most popular locations of Christian pilgrimage is the location believed to be the burial site of the Apostle Peter. This is the same place the Pope will often speak publicly to over 1 billion Catholics worldwide. Did the church get the history of Peter wrong? Was he crucified upside down, or even crucified at all? Before we continue to go through the evidence for the apostles, I want to show you an interesting study that was recently done on 157 people from different backgrounds. These participants were put through 4 different clinical trials to test their overall health. Each was blindfolded and given either a placebo or a new product called AG1 NextGen, which is the sponsor of today's video. And when you see the results, you're gonna be shocked. I've been taking the original AG1 for months now, but AG1 NextGen is their newest formula that's been clinically proven to work. What most people don't realize is that even if you're a relatively healthy eater like me, or like the 157 participants in this clinical trial, there's still some nutritional gaps you might have. And if you neglect to fill those gaps with quality nutrients, vitamins, and minerals, they could cause serious problems to your long-term health. This is why I love AG1 NextGen. They've upgraded their formula with even more probiotics and micronutrients, which is why the participants who took AG1 NextGen were able to meet 94% of their nutrient requirements, while the participants who were given a placebo only met 71%. Another thing I love about AG1 NextGen is that they've made this massive upgrade without even raising the price. When you scan the QR code or use my exclusive link, you can get started with AG1 NextGen for only $3 a day. If you're looking to improve your health long term, I encourage you to give it a try. After hearing that Matthew probably wasn't martyred, I was even more nervous to ask Dr. Sean about the Apostle Peter or Paul. So instead, I asked about
Bartholomew. AI says that he was possibly flayed alive.
Part of my scholarship is I had to go back and study the earliest counts of people being flayed. Because if you conclude that this is invented in the 3rd century, you can rule that out from the get-go. That was not a fun part of my research. So skinning was a practice that happened. And it was kind of a way of really not only physically tormenting somebody, but just dehumanizing somebody. Because your skin is how you present yourself to the world. And if you flay somebody's skin, you just kind of make them naked and humiliated and dehumanized. Was one of the reasons some groups would do that.
So at this point, I could feel my morning breakfast start to resurface. But even though it was hard to listen to, the fact that this type of torture existed while Bartholomew was alive confirmed that it was at least possible that Bartholomew could have been martyred this way.
But the earliest source is probably 500 or maybe even 600 AD for the flaying of Bartholomew. So we're talking half a millennia later for that account. Plus, I found at least 5 or 6 other traditions of the death of Bartholomew. I think accounts of him being drowned, burned alive, maybe stoned to death, stabbed to death, maybe one was crucified. I mean, there are so many accounts from Bartholomew, and they're all so late that I just think he probably falls in the category of indeterminate.
So we don't really know what happened to Bartholomew, but what about
Thomas, doubting Thomas, stabbed with spears in India.
Thomas was one of my favorite apostles to study.
If you remember, Thomas was the one that doubted that Jesus rose from the dead until he actually saw him with his own eyes.
Also in John 7, when they're like, go to Judea, he's like, let's go and die with Jesus. Like, there's something bold about him. So in one sense, if any apostle is going to make it to India, he seems to maybe have the kind of character.
The story goes that Thomas traveled from Jerusalem to India to work as a carpenter for the northern ruler of India, King Gondophares. He was supposed to build the king a palace, but instead gave the money to the poor. The king obviously wasn't happy about this, so he threw Thomas in prison. But that night, the king's brother was taken by an angel to see the palace that Thomas had received in heaven for the money that he had given to the poor. the king's brother told the king what had happened, and they both asked for forgiveness and released Thomas. Thomas then made his way down to southern India, where he preached, performed miracles, and then was martyred with spears. This story comes from a source called the Acts of Thomas, which was written just outside the window of living memory.
It's full of some legendary content, but also seems to have a historical core. Like there's a King Gondopharus that's mentioned, and coins have been found that date a King Gondopharus to that time and that place. And there's a few other kind of historical connections.
Another one of these connections is what the early church fathers say about Thomas. Even though they don't mention his death, they all agree that he established the church in India. There's also a group called the St. Thomas Christians who have a more straightforward version of the apostles' martyrdom that has been preserved through their own songs and poetry. So we can be fairly certain that Thomas died in India, but was the apostle Thomas martyred in India, or did he die naturally like Matthew?
But historically speaking, we'd have to admit that we're on, I think, somewhat thin ice to make that case.
So where would you place him in the categories?
I place him in the category of more plausible than not. Like 51% if I had to put a number on it.
Finally, there was one apostle who was at least probably martyred, and he wasn't the only one.
If you take Andrew, there's two different, somewhat early accounts of his crucifixion.
But this is another problem with trying to vet church history. If you have two accounts of the same thing, how do you know one source wasn't just copying another earlier source?
One describes him like dying on a tree. The other describes crucifixion. They're both a kind of crucifixion, but the way it's described is so different that they're likely not just copying one another. I'd probably move it back up to more probable than not.
This will be important to remember, especially when we get to Jesus' closest disciple, Peter. Was Peter crucified upside down in Rome? Was my favorite apostle Paul actually martyred by Nero? But I wasn't quite ready to ask about these guys just yet. I was just excited that at least church history wasn't wrong about two of the apostles at this point. But even these were not for sure. That top section was still totally empty. Did we have any good concrete evidence that church history was right about at least one of the apostles?
James, the son of Zebedee, killed by King Herod Agrippa I in Jerusalem.
We have one primary early source for that, which is Acts 12:2.
The Bible says here that Herod the king stretched out his hand to harass some of the church. Then he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword.
Now, I think we can trust that account for two reasons. Number one, there's a lot of good evidence that Acts is a reliable historical book.
This is because the author of the book of Acts, Luke, records so many details about the history of the time that have been confirmed by outside sources and archaeology. For example, an inscription was found on the island of Cyprus with the name Sergius Paulus, and his title is governor. But the book of Acts also records that there was a governor of Cyprus with the same exact name who the apostle Paul preached the gospel to. And get this, the Sergius Paulus inscription was dated to the same exact year Paul would have been in Cyprus. Luke even records that King Agrippa martyred James because he wanted to please the Jews. And this pleasing of the Jews is exactly what we find other non-Christian historians saying about King Agrippa at the time. These are just a few of the many examples of the historical accuracy of the book of Acts. Plus, we have hundreds of manuscripts for the book of Acts that agree with one another, so we can confidently place this source in the time of the apostles.
I think the way you read it, I think AI probably got that one right.
Okay, so at least we have one apostle who we know with good certainty was martyred. But what about the rest of the apostles? One by one, we went through each of the 12 apostles.
Matthias. They said that he was stoned and then beheaded.
I don't think there's any reliable early accounts of his fates.
Simon the Zealot, it says, reportedly martyred in Persia.
They're really late and they're legend-filled, but I would put James, son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus. These are late traditions where we don't have any historical confidence how they died. I'd put Simon the Zealot in the same category of those who are indeterminate.
Philip, possibly martyred in Hierapolis.
Either indeterminate or maybe slightly in the direction of dying naturally.
Because I want to tell you about the shocking discoveries that Dr. Sean found out about the Apostle Peter and Paul, I'm not getting into all the details for some of these apostles, but if you're interested in learning more, Dr. Sean has put all of his research into his book, The Fate of the Apostles. But there was one more apostle that I wanted to ask him about before I asked about Peter or put my credibility on the line with the Apostle Paul, the Apostle John. This was an apostle's death that I was fairly certain I knew about.
This is what I've heard, AI aside, is John was sent, he was exiled to Patmos. Patmos is where he wrote Revelation. I think he says that. Boiled in oil, Patmos or something like that. He was boiled in oil. The oil didn't kill him, and then he was maybe sent to Patmos and then died there.
Okay, so maybe I didn't know as much as I thought I did about how John died.
There's actually a lot to untangle here.
Basically, the story from church history is that they tried to martyr John by placing him in a giant pot of boiling oil, but he supernaturally survived it, so instead they banished him to the island of Patmos, where he wrote the book of Revelation and died a natural death. There really aren't any sources about John's martyrdom that we can confidently place in the window of living memory. So maybe the boiling oil story is actually true.
The boiling oil piece appears in Tertullian, and we're getting now to the 200s into the 3rd century. And I think the consistent tradition is that John died naturally.
I was going to ask about Peter and Paul next, but something was really bothering me at this point, so I just had to ask.
Why would people make up all these stories about the apostles' deaths?
So if you had a apostle who founded your city and died there as a martyr, there was a certain level of authority you got with your church by grounding it that way. So that's where it's just hard to decipher what's somebody's motivation for reporting this, which one is true, which one is invented. It's really hard to know.
As a Christian, I don't want to believe something just because somebody said it's true. I want to follow the evidence, even if it goes against my traditions, which finally brought us to the Apostle Peter.
This is the big one. Crucified upside down in Rome at his own request because he felt unworthy to die in the same way as Jesus.
So one question I would have is, do you think the Romans regularly took requests about how you wanted to be crucified? My answer is probably not. Crucifixion upside down, there are some cases of people being crucified upside down. But the very first historical account of this is in what's called the Acts of Peter, end of the 2nd century, full of certain legendary accounts, but I think it traces a certain historical core as well. And it has Peter crucified upside down. But I think if you read it, it's making more of a theological point than a historical point, that the world is turned upside down because of sin. And Peter can kind of see the world as it is, and his death, in some sense like Jesus, will help turn the world right. I don't think it's meant to be taken historical, and I'm not sure how much I would trust the Acts of Peter on that account alone to conclude he was crucified upside down. Really, part of the question is, was Peter even crucified? One thing we know in crucifixion is the vast majority of crucified victims were completely stripped naked, to humiliate them and shame them. And yet in John 21, Jesus says to Peter, you will be taken where you don't want to go and clothed by another.
This is a passage in the book of John where Jesus literally tells Peter the way he's going to die. So why does Jesus say that Peter's death is going to somehow involve being clothed?
Wait a minute. If it's going to be clothed by another, in crucifixion, you are not clothed. You are specifically unclothed in most cases. So this scholar argued that there were people that were clothed with a certain kind of flammable material and were put to death during the reign of Nero, and Peter probably was put to death that way. I don't know that we can prove that, but I really doubt he was crucified upside down, and I'm even more skeptical now that he was crucified.
So we know Jesus told Peter he would become a martyr in the book of John, but whether Peter was crucified or burned to death, are there any sources outside of the book of John that point to Peter's martyrdom?
The consistent early narrative of Peter we have about 10 sources from the 1st and 2nd century, is that Peter really died as a martyr. That's what I think we can bank on.
There are more early sources for Peter than any apostle we have looked at so far. So I guess the Christian tradition that Peter died as a martyr was right after all. This is comforting to know that there's so much evidence for the martyrdom of Peter even outside of the Bible. I honestly just wanted to end the conversation there until...
You didn't ask me about Paul, by the way.
Oh yeah, that is what I was going to ask.
He's kind of a big deal.
Yeah, Paul was a big deal. A bigger deal to me than Dr. Sean knew at the time. I had already made an entire video where I stated that the Apostle Paul was martyred in Rome. But it wasn't just that my credibility was on the line, it was much bigger than that. Other than Jesus, the Apostle Paul is my all-time favorite person in the Bible. The interesting thing about the Apostle Paul is that after he preached the gospel across the Roman Empire, the Bible says that Jesus made a promise to him that he was going to send him to the city of Rome to preach to the emperor. And I had always heard that after Paul preached to Nero, he put Paul in a Roman prison where he wrote these words in a letter to his protege Timothy while he waited for a prison guard to execute him. For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. Finally, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me on that day, and not to me only, but also to all who have loved his appearing. I've often turned to these verses to remind myself what life is really all about. While everyone else was focused on comfort and happiness, Paul had a greater purpose in life, to serve Christ no matter the cost. But if it's all just a lie...
So yeah, let's talk about Paul. Do you think he was beheaded by Nero?
Could be. We have around 8 sources, roughly, 1st and 2nd century, that consistently tell us that Paul made it to Rome and died in Rome. And beheading probably is the most likely death for Paul. He was a Roman citizen, so he would have been spared of crucifixion, at least for the most part. And so I think he was beheaded. I couldn't find any other account of Paul that he died in any other fashion that matched up with the historical record. So that's why I put the highest level, or at least very probably true plus, my highest category of apostles: James, son of Zebedee, Peter, and Paul. We can bank on those as apostles. Andrew and Thomas, more probable than not. I think the remaining 8 either died naturally or are indeterminate historically speaking. I think that's where the evidence points.
The truth is that whether most of the apostles were martyred or not, it doesn't change the truth of God's word. Jesus died, rose from the dead, and then each of the apostles endured incredible amounts of persecution for telling everyone that he had risen.
Just read the beginning of Acts. They're threatened, they're beaten, they're thrown in prison. They're not making up a story. They believed it, and they're not liars, and were at least willing to put their life on the line, and we have good evidence that some of them really died as martyrs.
In fact, the book of Acts records that all of these horrible things happened to the Apostle Paul as he preached the gospel across the entire Roman world. And I've made an entire video showing all of Paul's adventures and hardships on a map. Just click here to see exactly how Paul, whose name literally means small and insignificant, ended up face to face with the most powerful man in the entire world at the time, Emperor Nero.